A normal morning at a Los Angeles hospital turns into chaos when a millionaire snaps and stomps on his pregnant wife's stomach right there in the hallway. Her scream cuts through the silence, echoing off the white walls, and before anyone can move, a doctor sprints from the far end of the corridor, grabs the man by the shoulders, and slams him against the wall. The crowd gasps. The security camera blinks red, and in that split second, everything changes. What follows is not just a story about violence, but about truth, justice, and a woman who refuses to be broken. Stay with me, because when the footage leaks, the entire nation takes sides. Tell us what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to drop a comment below. The noon light poured through the tall windows of Memorial Hospital in Los Angeles, turning the polished floor into a mirror of brightness. Everything was quiet, except for the distant hum of machines and the steady rhythm of footsteps. Grace Holloway sat on a cushioned chair near the consultation desk, her hands folded gently over her rounded belly. Her light sky-blue maternity dress looked almost translucent under the fluorescent glow. She was 7 months pregnant, calm, careful, and visibly exhausted. What should have been a simple prenatal visit had already stretched longer than expected. Her husband, Leonard Holloway, stood beside her, his posture stiff, his face expressionless. The doctor had just stepped out to prepare a report on Grace's latest ultrasound. The moment the door closed, Leonard's calm cracked like glass. "Another test, another expense," he muttered, his voice cutting through the sterile air. "Every time I turn around, there's a new bill, a new excuse to spend my money." His words were low at first, but bitterness made them rise. Grace looked up quickly, her voice soft but firm. "Leonard, please. It's not just another test. The doctor said the baby might need special monitoring. My pressure is a little high. It's for her safety." "Her safety," he repeated with a cold laugh. "You're already deciding she's a girl. You don't even know that for sure." The doctor saw it clearly. Grace's voice trembled. "We're having a daughter." Leonard's face changed. The polite public mask he always wore disappeared, replaced by something darker. "A daughter," he said slowly. "You mean a useless mouth to feed? You think I built everything I have to end up with some little girl who'll just take what's mine?" Grace pressed a hand to her belly instinctively. The baby moved, startled by the tension in her mother's body. She took a careful breath, hoping to calm the storm she knew too well. "Leonard, please, don't do this here. People are watching. I don't care who's watching." His voice grew louder, bouncing off the hallway walls. A nurse turned her head, hesitated, and quickly looked away. "You think because I have money, you can waste it like water? Private hospital, organic food, personal trainer, special vitamins. You live like a queen while I pay for your comfort." "No." Grace looked around, desperate for the doctor to return. The hospital corridor that had felt safe now felt too bright, too open. She lowered her head, trying to shield herself from his glare. "It's not about comfort, it's about our child." "Stop saying that," he snapped. "Stop acting like you care about this baby more than I do. You don't even know what sacrifice means." He took a step closer, his shadow stretching across her dress. "You're pathetic, Grace. You've turned pregnancy into a stage performance." Her voice broke. "Leonard, please stop." He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "You think you can embarrass me in public? You think I'll let you make me look weak?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not trying to embarrass you." His words came out as a hiss. "You already did." He stepped back, his jaw tightening, his hands flexing, as if trying to contain something he could no longer control. Then, in one violent motion, he shoved the chair with his leg. The chair struck her shin, and Grace stumbled backward. Her heel slipped on the smooth tile. She fell hard, gasping, one hand clutching her belly, the other bracing for impact. The sound of her fall echoed down the corridor. A nurse called out, "Ma'am, are you all right?" But Grace could not answer. Her breath came in short bursts, her eyes wide with terror. She tried to sit up, to protect the child inside her, but Leonard was already looming over her. "Get up!" he barked. "You're embarrassing yourself." She tried to speak, but the pain in her abdomen silenced her. "Leonard, please! The baby!" Something flickered in his eyes. Anger, disgust, something twisted by pride. "You think you can control me with that baby?" he shouted. Then his body moved before his mind could stop it. He lifted his foot and brought it down toward her stomach. The motion was fast, brutal, final. The sound that followed was not a cry at first, but a single sharp gasp that tore itself from Grace's chest. Then came the scream, raw and terrible, a sound that froze everyone within earshot. Nurses at the far end of the corridor stopped mid-step. A clipboard clattered to the floor. For one suspended second, the hospital seemed to stop breathing. Grace's hands flew to her belly, her fingers trembling uncontrollably. Her face twisted in pain and disbelief. She looked up at him, eyes full of horror, unable to understand how the man who once whispered promises against her hair could do this now. Her scream broke again, louder this time, echoing down the hallway. Leonard's chest heaved, his foot still hovering above the floor as if even he could not believe what he had done. "I didn't mean to," he muttered, his voice small and distant. "You made me angry. You pushed me." From behind, a door burst open. The sound of running shoes on tile cut through the stunned silence. A tall man in blue scrubs appeared, moving fast, his expression a mix of instinct and rage. It was Dr. Ethan Ward, one of the hospital's trauma physicians, broad-shouldered, steady, and built like someone who had seen violence before. His voice thundered through the hallway. "Hey, step away from her!" Leonard turned, startled, but before he could react, Dr. Ward closed the distance between them in 3 powerful strides. His hand grabbed Leonard's shoulder, and in a single controlled motion, he spun him against the wall. The impact reverberated through the corridor. Leonard grunted in shock as the doctor's arm pressed firmly across his chest, pinning him in place. Grace gasped at the sound, her hands still clutching her stomach. Tears rolled down her face, her breathing shallow but steady enough to speak. "Help me," she whispered. Dr. Ward's eyes stayed locked on Leonard. "Don't move," he warned, his tone low and calm but deadly serious. The tension in the air was unbearable. Nurses hovered nearby, afraid to intervene but unable to look away. Leonard's arrogance faltered. He stammered, "You don't know who I am." "I don't care who you are," Dr. Ward said. "You just tried to hurt a pregnant woman. You don't deserve to be anywhere near her." For a long second, no one spoke. The sterile smell of disinfectant hung heavy in the air. Then the faint sound of Grace's breathing filled the silence. She was alive. The doctor's grip remained firm, every muscle in his arm taut with controlled restraint. Grace's eyes fluttered open again. Through the blur of tears, she saw Leonard pinned, powerless, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his expression twisted with disbelief. She took a shallow breath and whispered to herself, "It's over." Dr. Ward looked back briefly, his voice softer now. "You're safe. I've got you. Lan." That was where it ended. The corridor that had begun in calm silence now held the echoes of violence, pain, and one woman's broken trust. The doctor's heartbeat thudded in his ears as he stood between the victim and her attacker. Grace lay trembling, her hands still wrapped around the fragile curve of life inside her. The world had stopped moving, and in that stillness, everything had changed. The sound of Grace's scream still echoed faintly through the hallway long after Dr. Ward had pinned Leonard against the wall. The moment had passed, but the air remained heavy, charged with shock. Then the hospital's alarm tone cut through the silence, followed by hurried footsteps. 2 security officers turned the corner, startled by the chaos. "Doctor." Ward released Leonard slowly, but his voice was sharp and clear. "Stay right where you are." The officers moved in at once. Leonard protested weakly, but his defiance was fractured. His expensive watch glinted as one of the guards held his arm. Grace was still on the floor, her breathing shallow, her fingers trembling against the curve of her belly. The blue fabric of her dress had darkened with blood near the hem. Her lips moved, forming words that were almost soundless. "The baby, please." Dr. Ward dropped to his knees beside her, one hand on her shoulder, the other checking her pulse. "You're all right, Grace. I need you to stay awake for me. We're going to get you to labor and delivery. Now." He looked up at the nearest nurse. "Call a trauma team. Code OB emergency. We need a stretcher immediately." The nurse dashed off while another crouched beside Grace, holding gauze against her leg where a scrape had opened from the fall. Grace tried to lift her head, but pain shot through her abdomen, forcing her back down. Her face twisted, and her eyes filled with tears. "Please tell me she's still alive." "Aye?" Dr. Ward leaned close enough that his voice came out calm but firm. "We'll find out soon. I need you to breathe slowly and not move too much." He pressed his stethoscope lightly against her belly, listening. The rhythmic pulse of a fetal heartbeat came faint but steady through the device. Relief flickered across his face. "I've got it. The heartbeat's there." Grace exhaled shakily, a soft sob of gratitude escaping her. She clutched the side of his sleeve as if anchoring herself to the sound of his assurance. "Thank God," she whispered. The stretcher arrived, wheels squealing on the tile. The medical team lifted Grace carefully, supporting her head and shoulders. The motion made her wince. She gripped the railing beside her with white knuckles, eyes darting toward Leonard, who still stood under the guard's watch. Their gazes met for a fleeting second. His expression was cold, unreadable. "This isn't what it looks like," he said hoarsely. But no one answered him. The elevator doors opened. Dr. Ward moved with the team, one hand still on Grace's arm. "Vitals stable. Let's keep her flat. Monitor for uterine trauma and internal bleeding." He glanced at the nurse pushing the IV cart. "Prepare fluids. Get Dr. Patel in delivery ready. Tell her this patient is 7 months pregnant and took blunt force to the abdomen." The nurse nodded, already calling the command into her headset. Inside the elevator, the small space filled with beeping monitors and tense breathing. Grace kept her eyes open, staring at the fluorescent lights above. "I can feel her moving," she murmured. "She's still fighting." Dr. Ward gave a brief nod. "That's a good sign. Keep focusing on that. You both got through the worst part." When the doors opened again, the delivery wing burst into motion. Nurses pulled on gloves, wheeled in ultrasound machines, and adjusted the monitors. The air smelled of antiseptic and adrenaline. Grace was transferred onto a hospital bed. Cold gels spread across her stomach, and the monitor screen came alive with grainy movement. The image of a small curled body flickered into view, the faint pulse visible. "She's alive," said the technician. Heart rates elevated but strong. Grace's head turned toward the screen, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. "She's fighting," she said again, barely able to speak. "Doctor!" Ward stood beside her, arms crossed tightly, his voice softened. "So are you!" The tension in the room shifted from fear to careful urgency. Dr. Patel, the obstetrician, entered briskly, her eyes moving over the monitors. "We'll keep her for observation for at least 24 hours, she instructed. "There's abdominal bruising and risk of early contractions. We need to prevent stress to the uterus." Grace listened faintly, the words blurring into background noise. Her mind was still stuck in the hallway, hearing her own scream replay like an echo she could not stop. The doctor leaned closer. "Grace, can you hear me? You and your baby are both stable right now. I'm going to give you something mild to ease the pain." Grace nodded weakly. The injection stung, but the warmth that followed was almost comforting. Her breathing began to slow. Through the glass panel of the delivery suite, a nurse spoke with a police officer who had just arrived to take the initial statement. Dr. Ward wiped his hands on a towel, his expression firm but tired. "Tell them they'll need to wait until she's stable. She's been through enough for one day." The nurse relayed the message, and the officer nodded, jotting notes into his pad. Back inside, Grace stared at the ceiling tiles, tracing the repeating pattern as her body began to calm. Her fingers moved slowly over her belly, finding the faint rhythm of movement beneath her palm. "She's still here," she whispered. "She's still with me." Dr. Ward pulled a stool beside her bed. "Do you want me to contact a family member?" She shook her head slightly. "No one." He made sure of that. The doctor's expression darkened, understanding the weight behind her words. He rested his elbows on his knees. "You did everything right today. You survived something no one should ever go through." Grace's eyes met his. There was exhaustion, but also the fragile spark of resolve. "I don't know what happens next," she said quietly. "First," he replied, "you rest. Then you decide what kind of life you want to build for your child, one where fear has no place." The steady heartbeat on the monitor filled the silence between them, each beep a quiet reminder that life had endured. Outside the glass window, the sun had started to set, throwing a warm orange glow across the sterile room. Down the hall, the sound of the elevator opened again. A hospital administrator was speaking to police, her tone sharp and precise. "We have multiple witnesses and full camera coverage of the incident," she said. "The footage shows clear intent. We'll cooperate fully with the investigation." In the room, Grace's eyelids fluttered. She wasn't asleep, but she was fading into a dazed calm, the body's natural retreat from shock. Her last clear thought before the medication pulled her deeper was the sound of her baby's heart echoing in rhythm with her own. For the first time in years, she was not thinking about Leonard's voice, his criticism, or the way he controlled her every move. All that existed now was the slow beeping of the monitor and the quiet certainty that she and her child had survived. "Doctor." Ward stood and adjusted the blanket over her. "You're safe here," he said softly, more to himself than to her. Then he stepped out of the room to speak with the officers waiting in the corridor. The door closed gently behind him, leaving Grace in a pool of golden light. The monitor continued to pulse, steady and alive, the fragile sound of survival filling the silence of the night that was just beginning to fall. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady hum of machines and the rhythmic beeping from the fetal monitor. A soft golden light filtered through the blinds, turning the sterile walls into muted shades of warmth. Grace Holloway lay still on the bed, one hand resting protectively on her stomach. The shock had not fully left her body. Her breathing was slow, shallow, almost mechanical. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and plastic tubing. Outside the glass door, footsteps echoed and hushed voices murmured. A few nurses exchanged looks of disbelief. They had seen patients in pain, but not like this. Not a woman whose injuries came from the man who was supposed to love her. The door opened quietly. Detective Nora Willis stepped inside, a folder tucked under one arm. She was in her late 40s, calm and composed, her badge clipped to a simple navy blazer. She approached the bedside with deliberate gentleness. "Mrs. Holloway," she said softly, "I'm Detective Willis. I know you've been through a lot, but when you're ready, I need to ask you a few questions." Grace turned her head slowly. Her eyes were red and swollen, but they still carried a trace of defiance. "Is he still here?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. The detective shook her head. "No, he's being held downstairs for now. He won't come near you again tonight." Grace closed her eyes, relief and disbelief mixing in her chest. "He always said that no one would believe me if I ever spoke up." Detective Willis pulled a chair closer. "Then it's time someone does." She sat, setting the folder on her lap, but not opening it yet. Her voice was calm, patient. "You don't have to rush. I just need to understand what happened before the attack. Start wherever it feels right." Grace stared at the ceiling for a moment before she spoke. "It started with small things. The way he watched me. The way he decided what I should wear, who I could see. At first, it felt like love, like he was protecting me. But it changed." The detective nodded, writing slowly. "When did it start to feel different?" "After I got pregnant," Grace said. "He didn't want a baby. Not really. He wanted control. He checked every doctor's bill, every grocery receipt. He called it discipline. I called it responsibility. I was wrong." Her voice wavered, but she continued. "When I told him the baby was a girl, something in him snapped. He stopped talking to me for a week. Then he started saying I was ungrateful, that I didn't respect everything he'd given me." Detective Willis listened without interrupting. "Has he ever hit you before today?" Grace hesitated. The silence stretched between them. Finally, she nodded. "Once. Last year. He grabbed my arm because I was late for a dinner with his business partners. I had bruises for a week, but he said it was an accident. After that, it was never hitting. It was words. He made me believe it was always my fault. He convinced me that keeping quiet was what a good wife did." The detective's pen stopped moving. Her eyes lifted. "You're not at fault for any of this. What he did today was not an argument. It was assault. And it could have killed both of you." Grace blinked, her throat tightening. When he lifted his foot, I couldn't move. I just froze. It was like my body stopped listening to me. I thought I was going to die. I thought my baby was already gone." Dr. Ward entered quietly, carrying a clipboard. His expression was calm but shadowed by concern. "Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to check on you." He set the clipboard down and examined the monitors. "Heart rate is steady. Blood pressure is improving. The baby's still holding strong." Grace managed a faint smile. "You saved us." Dr. Ward shook his head. "I reacted. You're the one who kept fighting. Most people would have gone into shock and not made it this far." Detective Willis stood. "Doctor, I'll finish up soon. We need her statement for the report, but she can rest after that." He nodded and stepped back toward the door, pausing for a moment. "Grace, if you start to feel any sharp pain, press the call button immediately." Then he left, his presence leaving behind a steady reassurance. Detective Willis sat again. "You said he always controlled the money. Do you have any access to your own accounts?" "No," Grace replied. "He handled everything. Even my paychecks from before we married went into a joint account that he managed. I had a card, but he checked every transaction. If I bought anything without telling him, he'd find out." "Did you ever tell anyone about the way he treated you?" "I tried once. I told my mother that Leonard had a temper. She told me to be patient, that all marriages have bad days, so I stopped trying. I thought maybe I was the problem." Her voice trembled. "But today, when he looked at me like that, I knew it wasn't just anger, it was hate. He hated me for carrying a daughter." The detective leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "You don't have to protect him anymore. What he did is a criminal act. You're safe now, but I need you to tell me exactly what happened from the start of the argument to the moment Dr. Ward stepped in." Grace took a long, shaky breath. She described every moment in painful detail. The way Leonard shouted about money, the way his words turned cruel, the moment she fell, and the crushing pain when his shoe hit her belly. Tears slid silently down her face as she spoke. The detective wrote without stopping, capturing every word. When Grace finished, the room was silent except for the soft hum of the monitor. Detective Willis closed her notebook slowly. "You were incredibly brave to survive that. I'm going to file an immediate report for domestic violence and attempted assault on a pregnant woman. That's a felony. He'll be facing serious charges." Grace stared at her hands. He always said he could make anything disappear, that he had lawyers who could fix every mistake. The detective gave a faint, knowing smile. Then he's about to find out that some things can't be fixed with money. For the first time since the attack, Grace felt something close to hope. It wasn't bright or loud, but it was there, like a fragile light she could barely hold. Dr. Ward returned briefly to check the monitor one last time. The baby's heartbeat thudded softly through the room, steady as a drum. Grace listened to it, letting the sound fill the emptiness inside her. Detective Willis stood, gathering her folder. "I'll be back in the morning. You don't have to do anything tonight except rest." Grace nodded. "Thank you." When the detective left, the room felt different. Not peaceful yet, but stronger, grounded. Grace shifted her hand over her stomach. The small movements beneath her palm were faint but real. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. Outside, night had fallen over Los Angeles. The hospital lights reflected against the dark sky, their glow steady and unwavering, much like the new strength beginning to rise inside her. The following morning began with the quiet hum of air conditioning and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes. Grace Holloway was awake, sitting upright in her hospital bed. Her body still ached, but her mind was sharper than it had been the night before. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Leonard's face as he raised his foot. The image replayed endlessly, sharp and cruel, refusing to fade. The door opened with a smooth click. A woman in a fitted black suit stepped in, her heels tapping softly against the tile. Her perfume carried the faint scent of lilies and confidence. She looked polished, composed, and expensive. "Mrs. Holloway," she said with a practiced smile. "My name is Catherine Bloom. I represent your husband, Leonard Holloway. He asked me to come check on you and make sure you are comfortable." Grace stared at her for a moment before replying. "Comfortable is not the word I'd use." Her tone was calm, but there was a coldness behind it. Catherine didn't flinch. She set her leather briefcase on the side table and folded her hands neatly. "I'm aware this has been a very difficult 24 hours for you. The incident yesterday was deeply unfortunate, but Leonard is extremely concerned about your well-being and the well-being of the baby." Grace's jaw tightened. "Is that what he told you to say?" Catherine smiled again, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "He told me to make sure you understand all of your options before this situation escalates unnecessarily. Mr. Holloway is prepared to cover every medical cost, every future expense, and any additional support you might require. He's also open to public acknowledgement of responsibility, quietly, of course." Grace looked at her in disbelief. "You mean he'll pay me to stay silent?" The lawyer tilted her head slightly. "I would not phrase it that way. What we're discussing is a resolution that avoids unnecessary legal complications, emotional distress, and unwanted publicity. This is a private matter between husband and wife. It doesn't need to become a public spectacle. Grace's voice rose slightly. He tried to kill our baby. Catherine's tone remained even, almost soothing. He lost control of his temper. It happens. Stress, pressure, emotional strain. None of that excuses the act, of course, but context matters. My client is already arranging therapy and anger management counseling. He wants to make things right. Grace turned her gaze to the window, sunlight reflecting on her pale face. He doesn't get to make things right. Not after that. Catherine opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. Inside were several typed pages with neat signatures at the bottom. This agreement outlines financial arrangements for your continued care, as well as a formal apology letter for public record if necessary. In exchange, you agree not to pursue criminal charges or civil action. Grace's fingers gripped the blanket. Her heartbeat picked up in the monitor beside her. You think I would sign that? The lawyer's voice softened, carrying the tone of reason. You've been through a terrible ordeal. Stress like this can be very dangerous for the baby. If the media gets involved, it could prolong your trauma. Leonard wants peace for both of you. Grace let out a short, bitter laugh. Peace for him, you mean? Catherine adjusted her posture slightly, still composed. You may not believe this now, but your husband deeply regrets what happened. He's not a monster. He's a man who made a mistake. Grace met her eyes. A mistake is spilling coffee. What he did was a choice. Before the lawyer could reply, the door opened again. Dr. Ethan Ward entered, clipboard in hand, his expression unreadable. He glanced briefly at Catherine before speaking. Everything all right in here? Catherine turned with a polite nod. Dr. Ward, I was just having a brief conversation with Mrs. Holloway about her options moving forward. Her options? His tone was flat. I didn't realize being assaulted came with negotiation terms. Catherine's professional composure didn't waver. Doctor, I'm simply ensuring my client's wife is aware of the resources available to her, including full medical coverage, emotional counseling, and a generous settlement that protects both parties. Dr. Ward stepped closer to Grace's bedside. The only thing she needs protected right now is her and her child's safety, and I'd appreciate if you didn't bring her stress levels any higher than they already are. The lawyer gathered her papers calmly. I'll make a note of your concern, doctor. She turned back to Grace. Think carefully about what you want, Mrs. Holloway. Legal battles can take years. They can drain your finances and your health. Sometimes, the kindest choice is to end things quietly and move on. Grace looked up, her voice steady now. Quietly is how he's gotten away with everything his whole life. For the first time, Catherine's mask faltered slightly. You sound certain of that. I am, Grace said, and I'm done keeping his secrets. Catherine's eyes narrowed briefly, then she straightened, returning to her professional tone. Then I have done my duty. I'll inform my client that you declined the offer. I only hope you won't regret this decision when the reality of the court system becomes clear. Dr. Ward's voice cut through the tension. I'll make sure she doesn't have to face it alone. Catherine snapped her briefcase shut, her movements crisp and efficient. Good day, Doctor, Mrs. Holloway. She left without another glance, the click of her heels fading down the hall. For a long moment, silence filled the room again. The faint beeping of the monitor was the only sound. Grace exhaled slowly, her body trembling from the effort of holding herself together. They really think money fixes everything, she said quietly. Dr. Ward placed the clipboard on the counter and leaned against the foot of the bed. People like him believe money can erase any damage they cause. But this isn't something he can buy his way out of. Grace looked down at her hands. The hospital light made her wedding ring gleam, mocking her. Slowly, she pulled it off and set it on the table. Then he's about to learn that lesson. Dr. Ward gave a small nod. Good, because after what he did, the law is on your side, and this hospital has enough witnesses and video evidence to make sure justice actually happens. Grace's lips pressed together, her voice almost a whisper. I'm scared. That's normal, he said. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about standing anyway. Grace turned toward the window again. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to dip, staining the city skyline in orange and pink. For the first time since the attack, she felt something shift inside her. It was small and fragile, but real. The fear was still there, but beneath it was something stronger, a quiet resolve that would not fade this time. Dr. Ward checked the monitor one last time. "You're stable. Rest as much as you can tonight. Tomorrow, the police will take your full statement. After that, this moves into their hands." Grace nodded. "I'll be ready." He gave a faint smile. "That's good to hear." When he left, the room settled into calm again. Grace looked at the ring lying on the table. The gold surface caught the last light of the setting sun before dimming as the shadow of evening crept across the room. She whispered to herself, "No more silence." No. The faint sound of her baby's heartbeat pulsed through the monitor, steady and strong, echoing the promise she had just made. The day had begun with fear, but it ended with a decision. She was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a mother preparing to fight back. Morning sunlight spilled across the polished floor of the hospital hallway, glinting against the silver lettering on the door marked "Patient Consultations." Inside, Grace Holloway sat upright in a chair opposite Detective Nora Willis. Her face was pale but steady, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The worst of the physical pain had eased, but the silence between questions carried its own weight. The detective's notebook lay open on the table, half filled with neat handwriting from the night before. Grace's testimony was now official. The next steps were legal. Outside the glass door, movement stirred. The hinges creaked softly, and a figure entered without knocking. It was Catherine Bloom again, dressed in a new charcoal gray suit, her posture sharp and unyielding. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her stood another man in a navy blazer, carrying a briefcase embossed with the initials L.H. Detective Willis straightened slightly. "This is a private consultation," she said. Catherine's tone was smooth, practiced, and polite. "Detective, this is Mr. Holloway's financial counsel, Mr. Donnelly. He's here to clarify a few matters on behalf of my client. We want to prevent any unnecessary legal escalation." Grace looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. "You're here to protect him again." Catherine smiled faintly, as if speaking to a child who misunderstood. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm here to protect both parties from irreparable harm. Your husband made a terrible mistake, but dragging this through court, through months of media exposure, will only hurt you and your child." Detective Willis folded her hands calmly. "This conversation can proceed only if Mrs. Holloway wishes to continue it." Grace's eyes flicked toward the detective, then back to the lawyer. "Go ahead," she said quietly. "Let's hear what he's offering now." Catherine opened a thin folder. "Leonard wishes to demonstrate his remorse through immediate action. He's prepared to provide full financial support for both you and the baby, including housing, medical coverage, and a trust fund that ensures lifelong stability. He'll also begin therapy immediately and make a public donation to a women's health foundation. In return, you'll agree not to pursue criminal charges or media involvement." Grace blinked slowly. "A trust fund," she repeated, as if testing the words. "So my silence has a price." The man beside Catherine, Mr. Donnelly, spoke for the first time. "Mrs. Holloway, please understand, this is standard practice in high-profile domestic disputes. It protects reputations on both sides." Grace's voice sharpened. "The only reputation I care about right now is my daughter's safety." Catherine's expression didn't falter. "Safety comes in many forms. Financial stability is one of them. Without this agreement, you'll face court hearings, depositions, public scrutiny. That kind of stress can affect your health, even your pregnancy." Detective Willis interjected. "You're suggesting that pressing charges could harm her baby. That's dangerously close to coercion, counselor." Catherine met the detective's gaze coolly. "I'm simply reminding her of medical reality. Stress can have consequences." Grace looked down at her trembling hands. The memory of Leonard's shoe striking her belly flickered behind her eyes. Every word Catherine spoke felt like an echo of his manipulation. He used fear as a leash, and now his lawyer was holding the same rope. When Grace spoke again, her voice was quiet but firm. "Tell him he doesn't need to worry about public scrutiny. He should have thought about that before he attacked me in a hospital full of cameras." "Mo." Catherine's lips thinned. "You understand that once this goes public, the media will dissect every detail. They'll question your motives, your behavior, even your past. The story will stop being about what he did and start being about who you are. Grace's fingers gripped the edge of the chair. Let them ask. Let them see everything. I have nothing to hide anymore. Dr. Ethan Ward appeared at the doorway, his expression unreadable. Am I interrupting something? Detective Willis motioned for him to enter. Perfect timing! We were just listening to another settlement proposal. The doctor's gaze landed on Catherine. You again. Does your client think he can buy his way out of this? Catherine closed the folder calmly. Dr. Ward, you've already involved yourself enough. This isn't your concern. It became my concern the moment I saw a man try to harm a pregnant woman under my care, he said evenly. Catherine's tone remained smooth. Leonard is already cooperating with therapy and willing to make amends. Surely, as a doctor, you can understand rehabilitation. Dr. Ward's eyes narrowed. Rehabilitation requires accountability first. I haven't seen any yet. Mr. Donnelly cleared his throat. This is getting unnecessarily adversarial. We're here to extend an olive branch, not start another fight. Grace looked at him. An olive branch wrapped in a contract and silence. You come. The detective nodded slowly, closing her notebook. This meeting's over. Mrs. Holloway has made her position clear. Catherine exhaled softly, then turned toward Grace. Think carefully before you refuse. Once this moves to court, the process will be brutal. The lawyers he hires will be relentless. They'll question your emotional stability, your fitness as a mother, and your motives for pressing charges. Grace looked directly at her, unblinking. You mean they'll lie? Catherine paused, then gave a small, restrained smile. They'll defend him. Dr. Ward stepped forward slightly. Mrs. Holloway has already endured the worst part. There's nothing your team can threaten her with that she hasn't already survived. Grace took a long breath. Her pulse steadied. You can tell Leonard he can keep his money, his lawyers, and his fake apologies. I'll take justice instead. The lawyer gathered her papers with deliberate calm, slipping them back into her briefcase. Very well, but remember, once this is public, you can't take it back. Grace's reply came without hesitation. I don't want to. When they left, the door closed softly behind them. The sound was final, like a seal on a choice that could no longer be undone. Detective Willis looked at Grace, her tone gentler now. That was brave. You just told one of the most powerful attorneys in this city that you can't be bought. Grace let out a shaky breath. I used to think silence protected me. It only protected him. Dr. Ward leaned against the counter, arms folded. You just took the hardest step. The rest will be painful, but at least it's honest pain, not the kind that eats you alive in secret. Grace nodded. The tension in her shoulders loosened slightly. What happens next? The detective stood, tucking her notebook under her arm. I'll finish the official report and forward it to the district attorney. The charges will include aggravated assault and attempted harm to an unborn child. From there, the state takes over. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. The state, she repeated softly. It's not just me anymore. Exactly, the detective said. You're not alone in this. As the two professionals left the room, Grace sat back in the chair. The late afternoon sun painted the walls in soft gold. The baby moved faintly beneath her palm, a quiet reminder of why she couldn't give in. The ring she had removed earlier still lay on the table, catching the light. She stared at it for a long time before reaching over and placing it inside an empty plastic cup. The sound was small but sharp, a clean break from everything that came before. Grace whispered into the stillness, her voice low but certain. He can keep his money. I'll keep my soul. The faint heartbeat on the monitor pulsed steadily beside her, each soft beep echoing like a promise that this time she wouldn't back down. The first ripple began early the next morning. At 7 a.m., a video appeared on a small social media page for hospital workers. Within minutes, it was shared again, and by noon, it had reached every major platform in the country. The footage was only 40 seconds long, taken from a hallway security camera. It showed Leonard Holloway raising his foot and bringing it down toward his pregnant wife's stomach, followed by Dr. Ethan Ward rushing in and forcing him against the wall. The audio was faint, but Grace's scream could be heard clearly. It cut through the static like something alive, something impossible to forget. By midday, the clip had gone viral. Television anchors interrupted scheduled programs with breaking news. The words flashed across every screen in bold red. Millionaire real estate mogul attacks pregnant wife inside Los Angeles hospital. News helicopters hovered above Memorial Hospital. Reporters crowded outside the emergency entrance. Every major talk show replayed the footage, blurring Grace's face but keeping the violence visible. The outrage was immediate. Across America, thousands of comments poured in. Some were short and furious. How could anyone do this? Others came from women who had lived their own silent stories. I was her once. No one believed me then, but we believe her now. Hashtags multiplied by the minute. Number, Justice for Grace. Number, Stop the Silence. Number, No Excuse for Violence. The tone of the internet shifted from gossip to moral uprising. Even those who did not know her name shared the same message. There was no justification, no defense, no excuse. Inside a downtown office tower, Leonard's public relations team worked in panic. His media strategist, Greg Sullivan, paced between phone calls, barking orders. "We'll call it an edited video. We'll say it's been manipulated," he said. Assistants typed feverishly, drafting statements for online release. Within an hour, the first headline appeared on a business website. Sources claim Holloway footage misleading. Leonard approved the draft without reading. "Do whatever it takes," he snapped. "I'm not letting this destroy me." But it was already too late. By afternoon, nurses from the maternity wing had confirmed the footage was real. One of them, interviewed anonymously on a live broadcast, said she had been there. Her voice shook but did not waver. "He attacked her. We all saw it. The doctor saved her life." That single statement unraveled every attempt at denial. Grace remained in her hospital room, unaware at first of how large the story had become. She had refused to look at her phone since the night before. When Dr. Ward came in to check her vitals, his tone was careful. "The news has the video," he said quietly. "It's everywhere now." She froze. "Everywhere?" He nodded. "People are angry. The world's finally seeing what he did." Her mind spun. She imagined millions of strangers watching the worst moment of her life, over and over. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but it's out now, and it might be the thing that keeps you safe." By evening, protesters had begun gathering outside Leonard's corporate headquarters. Women held signs that read, "Protect mothers, not monsters, and her pain is our pain." Television crews lined the sidewalks. News anchors interviewed domestic violence advocates, lawyers, and survivors. They spoke about systemic silence, about how power had protected men like Leonard for too long. Meanwhile, Leonard filmed a statement from his penthouse. The curtains were drawn, and his face was pale under studio lights. "The video circulating online," he began, "does not represent the truth. It was taken out of context. My wife has been struggling emotionally during her pregnancy, and I was only trying to help her up after she fell." His voice was smooth, rehearsed, practiced. The video went live on his verified account. It backfired instantly. Comment sections flooded with outrage. Screenshots of his words spread with captions like, "He calls this helping," and "No context excuses cruelty." Influential figures, including television hosts and senators, condemned his statement. Overnight, his corporate sponsors withdrew partnerships. A luxury housing project bearing his name quietly removed its signage. At the same time, Grace's name became a symbol. People across the country left flowers outside hospitals. Strangers painted murals of a woman's silhouette holding her unborn child, with the words, "We hear you, Grace," underneath. Radio hosts read messages from listeners who shared stories of their own survival. The movement that began with one scream had turned into a nationwide demand for accountability. The hospital's administrator came to Grace's room that evening. "Reporters are waiting outside," she said gently. "You can't stay here much longer without them finding you." Grace nodded. "I understand." Dr. Ward arranged for her transfer to a quiet neighborhood in Echo Park, where her friend Emily Park had offered her spare apartment. The hospital staff moved her discreetly through a side exit. The night air outside was cool and smelled faintly of rain. A single camera flash blinked from across the street, but no one followed. Emily opened the door before Grace could knock. She wrapped her arms around her tightly. "You're safe here," she said. "Stay as long as you need." Inside, the apartment was small but warm. A soft yellow lamp lit the corner of the living room. Grace sat on the couch, still in her hospital gown, her hands resting protectively over her belly. Emily placed a blanket over her shoulders and handed her a phone. "You should see this," she said quietly. Grace hesitated before unlocking the screen. Her social media notifications had exploded. Thousands of messages filled the feed. Some were from strangers sending prayers. Others came from women thanking her for surviving, for standing, for screaming. One message caught her eye. "You don't know me, but your strength gave me courage to leave my abuser. Thank you for reminding me that my life still matters." Grace read the words twice. Her vision blurred. Tears slipped down her cheeks, falling silently onto her hands. For the first time, they weren't from fear or pain, but from something else. Recognition. She leaned back into the couch. The sounds of the city faint through the open window. Cars passed on the street below, and somewhere, a dog barked. The glow of the phone screen flickered across her face. She looked out at the skyline. The soft lights reflected in her eyes. "I'm not alone anymore," she whispered. In that moment, the storm outside no longer felt threatening. It felt alive, powerful, and full of voices that refused to be silenced. The world had finally seen the truth, and Grace Holloway, sitting quietly in that small Los Angeles apartment, began to believe that her voice could change more than just her own life. The courthouse in downtown Los Angeles was already surrounded by cameras before sunrise. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder along the steps, their microphones raised toward the crowd that had gathered with signs and posters. The words "Justice for Grace" glimmered in the morning light, printed across cardboard and cloth. Some of the people waiting outside had never met her, yet they spoke her name as if she belonged to all of them. For weeks, the video had haunted the nation. Now, the man in that footage was finally facing the law. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and heavy. The marble floor reflected the glare of the fluorescent lights, and the low murmur of voices filled the courtroom until the bailiff called for silence. Grace Holloway sat at the plaintiff's table beside the district attorney. Her blue maternity dress fit neatly around her rounded belly. She looked fragile but composed, her back straight, her hands resting gently on her lap. The baby moved once, a faint reminder of the life she was fighting for. Across the aisle, Leonard Holloway entered through a side door. He wore a dark suit and tie, but his eyes were hollow. His face had lost the polished confidence it once carried. The weight of sleepless nights and public outrage hung over him. Catherine Bloom, his lead attorney, leaned in to whisper something, but Leonard stared straight ahead, refusing to respond. The judge entered, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled neatly back. The courtroom rose. "Be seated," she said. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had seen every kind of cruelty, yet never grown numb to it. "We are here today, in the case of the state of California versus Leonard Holloway, charged with aggravated assault, domestic violence, and endangerment of an unborn child." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the state will prove that the defendant knowingly and intentionally assaulted his pregnant wife inside Memorial Hospital. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of violence, one witnessed by multiple hospital staff and captured on security footage." When the video played on the large monitor, the courtroom went silent. The screen flickered, showing the hallway, the bright lights, the figure of Grace collapsing, and Leonard raising his foot. Her scream filled the room. Even though the video had been seen millions of times online, hearing it echo through the solemn quiet of the court struck differently. It was no longer just a headline, it was evidence. Grace looked down as the clip played. She could not watch, but she could feel the memory return like a pulse beneath her skin. When the footage ended, the silence lingered until the prosecutor continued. "The man who appears to help her afterward is Dr. Ethan Ward, who will testify today." Dr. Ward took the stand. He spoke calmly, describing every detail with precision. "I was walking through the maternity corridor when I heard shouting," he said. "When I turned the corner, I saw the defendant standing over Mrs. Holloway. She was on the floor, and he had just brought his foot down toward her abdomen. I reacted instinctively. I restrained him and called for security." Catherine Bloom rose for cross-examination. "Dr. Ward, isn't it possible that what you saw was an accident? That he was trying to help her up after she slipped?" The doctor's tone didn't change. "No, it wasn't an accident. The motion was downward, with full weight. It was an act of aggression." Catherine's lips tightened, but she moved on. "You have a strong sense of justice, Doctor. Is it possible your emotions affected your judgment?" Dr. Ward looked her directly in the eye. "If defending a pregnant woman from violence makes me emotional, Then yes, but it doesn't make me wrong. A few quiet murmurs rippled through the courtroom before the judge called for order. Next came Detective Nora Willis. She placed a stack of documents on the evidence table. Your Honor, these are records of prior complaints made against the defendant by female employees of his company. The pattern is clear: intimidation, harassment, and retaliation against women who spoke up. 2 were pregnant. 1 lost her child following prolonged verbal abuse. The prosecutor asked her to read a line from one of Leonard's internal emails. Her voice was steady as she read, "Pregnancy is a liability. I hire women who can work, not rest." Gasps rose from the audience. Grace closed her eyes. The judge tapped her gavel once. "Order, please." The defense tried to repair the damage. Catherine called an expert witness, a psychiatrist, who claimed that pregnancy hormones could cause heightened sensitivity and memory distortion. Mrs. Holloway's perception may have been influenced by stress, the expert said. But when the prosecutor asked if that explained the video evidence, the witness hesitated. "No," she admitted quietly. "The video is what it is." The tide had turned. When Grace was called to testify, the room grew still again. She walked slowly to the stand, her steps steady. After taking the oath, she looked toward the jury. Her voice was soft but clear. "He told me I made him angry, that I embarrassed him. I believed him for years. I thought if I stayed quiet, things would get better. But they didn't. And when I saw him lift his foot, I knew there was nothing left to save." Catherine stood. "Mrs. Holloway, is it true you refused my client's settlement offer?" "Yes," Grace said. "Why?" "Because silence is how he survived. I'm done being silent." The lawyer hesitated, then turned away. Leonard's jaw clenched. His composure cracked. "You're lying!" he shouted suddenly. "You're twisting everything! I just wanted to teach you a lesson!" The judge's gavel struck hard. "Mr. Holloway, control yourself or I will have you removed." The courtroom buzzed with whispers, reporters scribbling every word. Leonard slumped back into his chair, realizing too late what he had confessed. After hours of testimony, the judge dismissed the court for deliberation. The jury filed out, their faces grave. Grace stepped down from the stand, her knees weak but her expression calm. Dr. Ward met her at the aisle, steadying her with a quiet hand. "You did it," he said. She nodded faintly. "Not yet, but almost." Outside, through the tall courthouse windows, the crowd still waited. Some held flowers, others candles. The sky had turned a soft orange, and the sound of distant chanting carried on the wind. Grace sat on a bench in the hallway beside Dr. Ward and Detective Willis. The exhaustion of the day pressed against her, but beneath it was something steady, a quiet strength she had not felt in years. The detective looked at her and said, "Whatever happens next, you already changed more than you realize." Grace rested a hand on her belly. "Then it was worth it. You come." The camera flashes outside flickered against the glass, like tiny bursts of light breaking through the dusk. Inside, Grace waited for the verdict, her heart steady, her eyes fixed forward. The day she once feared had finally become the day she took her life back. That was where the trial paused. The gavel had fallen, the testimony was done, and the world outside was holding its breath for justice. The morning sun rose over downtown Los Angeles, casting a pale gold light across the courthouse steps. The air was still, heavy with anticipation. Crowds had already gathered before the doors opened, holding flowers, signs, and banners that read "Justice for Grace" and "No More Silence." News cameras stood shoulder to shoulder, reporters whispering updates into microphones. For 3 weeks, the country had waited for this day. Today, the verdict would be read. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense and hushed. Grace Holloway sat quietly at the front, her hands resting on her rounded stomach. She wore a soft blue dress, simple and elegant, the same color she had worn the day she testified. Around her, the low hum of whispered conversations filled the air like static before a storm. Dr. Ethan Ward sat a few rows behind her, his expression calm but firm, while Detective Nora Willis stood by the wall, her arms crossed, watchful. Across the aisle, Leonard Holloway entered through the defendant's door. His once sharp suit hung loosely on him now. His face was pale, drawn, almost hollow. The arrogance that once defined his every movement had faded. He looked smaller, diminished. like a man finally realizing that the walls around him were closing in. Catherine Bloom followed him, composed as always, but even her confident stride had lost its rhythm. The judge entered. "All rise," the bailiff called. The entire courtroom stood. Judge Eleanor Brooks took her seat, her silver hair gleaming under the lights. "You may be seated," she said. Her tone carried both strength and solemnity. She looked at the jury, then at the packed courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand the weight of this case on our community. Today, we listen." The foreperson of the jury rose, holding a sheet of paper. The sound of it unfolding seemed to echo. Leonard shifted uneasily. Grace did not move. On the charge of aggravated assault, the foreperson read, "We find the defendant, Leonard Holloway, guilty." The words struck the room like a pulse. A hush swept across the crowd. On the charge of domestic violence resulting in bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty. Leonard's jaw clenched. On the charge of endangerment of an unborn child, we find the defendant guilty. There was a moment of silence, then a quiet gasp rippled through the audience. Someone sobbed softly in the back row. Grace closed her eyes, her hand pressing lightly to her chest. She did not cry. Her expression was calm, steady, as though the storm had finally passed. Judge Brooks nodded slowly. "The jury has spoken," she said. "Mr. Holloway, please stand for sentencing." Leonard stood, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He looked toward Grace, his eyes dark with anger and disbelief. "This isn't justice," he muttered. "This is revenge." "La?" The judge's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Holloway, what you call revenge, the law calls accountability." She paused, letting her words fill the space. "This court has reviewed the evidence and the testimonies. It has seen the video. It has heard your own words. You used your power to harm, not to protect. You treated your wife and child as possessions, not lives. And today, the law will remind you that no man is above it." Her voice grew firm. "For the charges before this court, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 6. You are stripped of all paternal rights. You are to have no contact, direct or indirect, with Mrs. Holloway or her child, for life." The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Grace's quiet exhale. Leonard's mouth opened slightly, as if to protest, but no words came. His knees seemed to weaken. 2 officers stepped forward, moving to either side of him. "Take him into custody," the judge ordered. As they reached for his wrists, Leonard snapped, his voice cracking through the silence. "You think this makes you better than me? You all think you're heroes?" He turned toward Grace, eyes wild. "You ruined me." The officers tightened their grip, pulling his hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs echoed through the room. The judge's gavel struck once, firm and final. "Order! Remove the defendant." The doors opened. Reporters craned their necks, cameras flashing. Leonard was led away, struggling against the officers, shouting words no one cared to understand. The heavy doors shut behind him, muffling his voice into nothing. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. It was quiet at first, hesitant. Another followed, and then another, until the entire courtroom was filled with the sound of applause. Not for victory, but for relief, for survival, for justice finally delivered. Grace sat still, her eyes glistening, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Dr. Ward approached her gently. "It's over," he said. She looked up at him, her voice soft but sure. "No, it's just beginning." Outside the courthouse, the crowd had doubled. Reporters stood behind barricades as police guided people into lines. When the doors opened, the cheering erupted. Grace stepped out into the sunlight, flanked by Dr. Ward and Detective Willis. Flashbulbs flickered like bursts of lightning. People held up signs, some crying, others smiling through tears. An elderly woman reached out from the crowd, her hand trembling. Grace paused, took her hand, and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Thank you," the woman said, her eyes wet. "You spoke for all of us." Grace nodded, her lips trembling into a small, grateful smile. "Thank you for believing me." The cameras followed her as she walked down the courthouse steps. The sunlight reflected off the marble columns, surrounding her in a pale halo. Behind her, the crowd chanted, "Justice for Grace." Reporters shouted questions, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence now carried a different weight. It was not fear, it was peace. At the bottom of the steps, Dr. Ward held the car door open. Grace turned once more toward the courthouse, the building that had held her pain and her redemption. A breeze lifted her hair as she whispered quietly, "It's done." In that moment, she felt the baby move again, a soft flutter beneath her palm, as if the child understood. Across every news network that evening, headlines scrolled, "Justice delivered, Leonard Holloway sentenced, the nation listens." And in the quiet that followed, Grace Holloway became more than a name in a courtroom. She became a symbol of what courage could look like when silence finally breaks. The city had changed by the time spring arrived. The streets were quieter, softer, as if Los Angeles itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Months had passed since the verdict, and Leonard Holloway was now behind bars, serving his sentence in a state prison outside San Diego. The story that had once filled every headline had begun to fade, replaced by newer scandals and fresher noise. Yet Grace Holloway's name remained. To many, it meant courage, survival, and truth. To Grace, it meant something simpler. It meant peace. She lived now in a small apartment overlooking Echo Park Lake. The world outside her window felt calm. The scent of blooming jacarandas drifted in through the open balcony door. On the coffee table, a few letters lay unopened, many from strangers who still wrote to thank her. She had stopped giving interviews and stopped watching the news. She no longer needed to hear the world's opinion of her story. She was living its ending in real time. The calendar on the wall marked 38 weeks. Her due date was near. Emily Park, her closest friend, stayed with her often, helping her prepare the nursery and drive to her checkups. The baby's crib was a simple wooden one by the window, draped with a white blanket embroidered with the word Hope. Grace had chosen the name long before the trial ended. She whispered it to her belly every night as a promise. On the morning of March 17th, the first contractions began. Grace was standing by the sink, rinsing a mug, when a sharp pain gripped her from within. It wasn't fear that came, but clarity. She had waited for this moment, for the chance to bring something new into a world that had once tried to destroy her. Emily rushed her to St. Augustine Hospital, the same place where everything had nearly ended months ago. But this time, it felt different. The air was lighter, the faces familiar, the halls no longer haunted. Dr. Ethan Ward met them in the maternity wing. He was in his usual scrubs, calm and reassuring. "You're right on time," he said with a small smile. "Everything looks good. Let's get you settled." Grace nodded, gripping his hand as another wave of pain passed through her. "I can do this," she said through shallow breaths. "You already have," he replied. "Now you just finish it." The delivery room was softly lit. The sound of the fetal monitor filled the space with a steady rhythm. Nurses moved with quiet precision. Emily stood beside the bed, whispering encouragement. The contractions came stronger, closer together. Grace focused on her breathing, her eyes fixed on the clock that ticked softly on the wall. Each second stretched into eternity. She remembered the fear of the first hospital visit, the screams, the chaos. This time, there was none of that. Only strength, only life. Hours passed, and then suddenly everything shifted. The nurse leaned forward, her voice calm but alert. "Almost there, Grace. Just one more push." The room held its breath. And then it happened. The sound that erased every shadow. The sharp, pure cry of a newborn filled the air. The nurses smiled. Emily covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Grace lay back, her chest heaving, her eyes wet but bright. "She's here," she whispered. Dr. Ward lifted the tiny child and placed her gently on Grace's chest. The baby's skin was warm and pink, her little fists curling against her mother's heart. Grace looked down, her hands trembling as she stroked the fine hair on the baby's head. "Hi, Hope," she said softly. "Welcome home." The doctor smiled. "She's strong, perfectly healthy. You did beautifully." For a moment, time stopped. The machines hummed quietly, and the golden afternoon light poured through the window. Grace held her daughter close, feeling the heartbeat against her own. She whispered again, "You are the reason I'm still here." Outside the delivery room, the nurses who had been on duty that fateful day gathered near the window. They watched through the glass, their eyes glistening. One of them placed a small bouquet of daisies on the counter with a note that read, "For Grace and Hope, from the night that changed us all." Detective Nora Willis could not attend in person, but she sent a basket of flowers. The card inside carried a single sentence in neat handwriting: "For hope, proof that light survives." Grace read it later, holding the card between her fingers, her lips curving into a quiet smile. That evening, the world outside glowed in soft orange. The city that had once felt cruel now looked kind. Grace stood by the window, her daughter in her arms, wrapped in a pale blanket. She looked out at the skyline, the sun dipping low behind the palm trees, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years: safety. When Dr. Ward entered for the final checkup, he paused for a moment, watching her from the doorway. "How does it feel?" he asked. Grace turned to him, her eyes full. "Like a second chance." He nodded. "You earned it." The next afternoon, Grace was discharged. Emily came to pick her up, carrying a small car seat in both hands. The hospital lobby was calm, sunlight reflecting off the polished floors. A few people recognized Grace but said nothing. They just smiled as she passed. At the entrance, a handful of strangers stood quietly holding flowers. They didn't cheer or shout, they simply nodded in respect as she stepped outside with her daughter. Grace stopped for a moment. The baby nestled against her chest. "Thank you," she said softly to the small crowd. The air was warm, filled with the scent of rain from the night before. As Grace reached the car, she turned once more to look back at the hospital, the place where her life had broken and begun again. The glass doors slid closed behind her, their reflection catching her silhouette, a woman carrying hope into the sunlight. In the car, she cradled her daughter and whispered, "This time, it's a new beginning." As they drove away, the city shimmered around them, alive with light. The baby stirred, her tiny hand gripping Grace's finger. Grace smiled, her heart steady and full. Somewhere behind them, the courthouse, the cameras, the headlines, all faded into memory. Ahead stretched only the road, open and golden, leading toward a future that belonged entirely to them. And in that quiet drive through Los Angeles, Grace Holloway finally felt what she had fought for all along: freedom. A year had passed since the verdict, and Los Angeles had settled back into its usual rhythm. Yet, for many, the story of Grace Holloway had never truly faded. It had become part of the city's pulse, whispered in classrooms, in support groups, and in quiet conversations between mothers and daughters. The storm that once raged around her name had transformed into something calmer, something enduring. It had become a symbol. That morning, the sky was clear, the kind of soft California blue that seemed to promise healing. Outside Riverside Medical Center, a new wing was being unveiled. The plaque at the entrance shimmered in the sunlight, its bronze surface freshly polished. The words were simple but carried weight. The Grace Holloway Healing Wing, dedicated to the strength of survivors. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was alive with quiet celebration. Nurses moved through the corridors carrying flowers and trays of small pastries. Reporters adjusted their cameras, whispering last-minute notes to their producers. Grace walked slowly down the hallway, holding her daughter's tiny hand. Hope toddled beside her, her curls bouncing with each step. She wore a little white dress and held a small bouquet of pale blue flowers that matched her mother's dress. Grace's expression was calm, almost serene. The past year had reshaped her life in ways she had never imagined. She still received letters from women across the country, some thanking her for her courage, others telling her they had finally found the strength to leave their abusers. She answered as many as she could, writing late at night after Hope had fallen asleep. Her handwriting was small and neat, her words always gentle. "You are stronger than you know." As she reached the entrance of the new wing, she saw familiar faces waiting. Dr. Ethan Ward stood near the podium, wearing a light gray suit instead of his usual scrubs. Detective Nora Willis stood beside him, her hands folded, her badge gleaming faintly in the light. A few of the nurses from that night were there too. Their eyes met Grace's, and they smiled warmly. It felt like a full circle closing. The hospital director stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Today, we open not just a new facility, but a symbol of what resilience and compassion can build from tragedy. And there is no one more deserving to speak on this occasion than Mrs. Grace Holloway." Applause rippled through the small crowd. Grace took a slow breath and stepped up to the podium. The microphone crackled softly as she adjusted it. She looked out over the audience, seeing faces filled with expectation and kindness. Her voice, when she began to speak, was steady and warm. "I used to think silence kept me safe," she said. "That if I stayed quiet, I could control what happened to me. But silence doesn't protect anyone. It only protects the person who hurts you." The room was still. Even the air seemed to pause. "I'm not here to talk about what happened to me," she continued. "That story belongs to the past. I'm here to talk about what came after, about what happens when we decide that fear doesn't get the last word." Lead. She looked down briefly at Hope, who was sitting on Dr. Ward's knee, playing with a flower petal. Grace smiled faintly. "When my daughter was born, I named her Hope because she was the proof that something beautiful can grow out of pain. Every time I look at her, I remember that survival isn't just about living through something. It's about choosing what you'll do with it once you survive." Her eyes lifted again to the crowd. "So many women have told me they saw themselves in my story. They said they were afraid, that they felt invisible. But you're not invisible. You are seen, you are heard, and your voice matters more than you can imagine." A soft murmur moved through the room. Some of the women in the audience wiped tears from their eyes. Detective Willis watched from the back, her expression proud and quiet. Dr. Ward stood with his arms crossed, the hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. Grace's voice grew stronger. "We built this place for you, for every survivor who walks through these doors and needs to be reminded that her life is still her own. What happened to me does not define me. What I choose to do with it does, and I choose to help others find their way back to themselves." She paused, letting the words settle in the silence. The audience rose to their feet, applause swelling until it filled the room. Cameras flashed. For a moment, Grace closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. It was not the chaos of the past, not the roar of judgment or pity. It was something pure, recognition. When the applause quieted, Grace stepped down from the podium. Hope wriggled free from Dr. Ward's arms and ran to her mother, clutching her small bouquet of blue flowers. Grace knelt down and opened her arm. The little girl ran straight into them, laughing softly. Dr. Ward approached, his voice low. "You were incredible." Grace smiled up at him. "I just told the truth." "No, that's what makes it powerful," he said. Detective Willis joined them, slipping her hands into her coat pockets. "You changed more than a law," she said quietly. "You changed the way people see silence." Grace nodded. "Then it was worth everything." Outside, the midday sun was bright. The hospital courtyard was filled with families, doctors, and reporters. Grace stepped out with Hope in her arms. The light caught the bronze plaque, making the engraved letters shimmer. She walked toward it slowly, knelt down, and placed the small bouquet of pale blue flowers at its base. For a moment, she stood there, her fingers tracing the cool metal surface of her name. The world around her blurred into soft color and sound. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, but to life itself. Hope tugged gently at her hair, drawing a laugh from her. Grace lifted her daughter higher, kissing her forehead. Together, they turned toward the open courtyard, walking through the golden light. Behind them, the plaque glowed under the sunday. The Grace Holloway Healing Wing, dedicated to the strength of survivors. And as the scene widened, the crowd faded into the hum of city life. The last image was of Grace and Hope, walking hand in hand, framed by light and the endless blue sky. Across the screen, simple white letters appeared. "For every woman who thought she was alone, you are not."